SweetPro is a product built on these ingredients. I've got a SweetPro supplement sort of broken out in its components here. The nutrients or the sources of those nutrients are on the left-hand side of the screen here, and then what those sources are and how to group them within the supplement are on the right-hand side of the screen. First, we start with the protein and energy sources, primarily that are from dried distillers grains and solubles. One of the interesting things about SweetPro supplements is there's additional condensed distiller solubles in this product, in addition to what would already be in corn distillers grains with solubles. So there's additional CDS here. That protein source, bringing your attention to the left-hand side of the screen again, the protein is, as many of you know, from dried distillers grains is rumen degradable and undegradable protein, and then the energy is from soluble fiber and fat. One of the important things as we go through this talk will be the recognition that there is not any soluble sugars in this supplement. In addition, then SweetPro is made from a yeast fermentation culture, which has some yeast cells with it and has a variety of nutritional values, and then vitamins and minerals. We're really going to be focusing on the mineral side of this, and magnesium and calcium in particular. Okay, so when we think about trace mineral nutrition in cattle, we normally recognize that maybe a problem exists when we see clinical signs of some sort of morbidity. That with the Grass Tetany, that'd be a staggering sort of situation. However, recognize that we've already, once the clinical signs are observed, we've already compromised immune function, growth, fertility, and productivity. So once we're at clinical signs, we've almost gone too far in compromising what the health and productivity of our livestock can be. So I thought this criteria and ranking of priorities within the animal was a good way to think about how important trace mineral nutrition really is. So magnesium, which we all know is or expect to be the Grass Tetany problem or issue that we have to manage. A little bit about magnesium in an animal. First, it's about 0.05% of the animal's body weight is magnesium. Over 1,100 pounds, that's almost 9 ounces. Okay, 65 to 70% of that's stored in the skeleton, and another 30% in other tissues, importantly in muscle, other soft tissues, and extracellular fluid. In fresh tissue, that would include muscle and soft tissues. Here we have certain grams per kilo. So as body weight changes, maybe necessarily in proportion to skeletal mass, the amount in fresh tissue is scaled appropriately. Throughout the body and in metabolism, magnesium is bound to protein as a cofactor for many enzymes in oxidative phosphorylation and other mechanisms. Just so you know that magnesium is an important cofactor in many metabolic processes. There is an interesting rumen microorganism requirement for magnesium, and especially in those bacteria that break down cellulose, or the cellulolytic activity that we see in the ruminant for rumen fermentation. And then there's low levels of magnesium in cerebrospinal fluid, which is the component or compartment for magnesium, which would control nervous impulses, and when this compartment is spent or at levels lower than required, tetany or tetany occurs, and that continuous muscle contraction. Okay, grass tetany, as implied in the figure on the right, has some interactions between magnesium and calcium, as well as phosphorus and sodium, with a competition with potassium. So normally we think about potassium in a relationship to the combination of potassium, we think about potassium in a relationship with, or in a ratio with, calcium and magnesium. The challenge is balance between magnesium and calcium, and we'll get into some of the challenges animals are faced with in maintaining that balance. There's an interaction or competition with potassium, as I mentioned. Grass tetany occurs when there's high levels of potassium and nitrogen in forage, but that is based on what's available in soil, and low levels of sodium, phosphorus, calcium, and magnesium, again in the forage, but that is reflective of what's in the soil. Tetany is due to is a result of the role that those ions play in maintaining cell membranes. And then grass tetany is primarily an issue in ruminants, not necessarily nearly as prominent in other species. However, magnesium deficiency can occur in other species, but we generally deal with this on a very regular basis in ruminants, and that's because the ruminal fermentation that results from the ruminal fermentation that results from cool season forages that are in the spring, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of the environment or the growing factors that contribute to this overall challenge. So what are some risk factors for grass tetany? Forages that are below 0.18% magnesium, or 0.2%, whatever rule of thumb you'd like to use. Here's that relationship between potassium with calcium and magnesium. This ratio happens with calcium in a relationship or a ratio with calcium and magnesium together. So one of the things that we're going to get into is the balance between calcium and magnesium, and that balance in relationship to potassium. This milliequivalent ratio takes a little chemistry to calculate, so I'm not going to go into all of that, but there's two rules of thumb that you might find useful. And just remember, through all of this, either I'll give you my contact information at the end, but also Tim will have certainly has ready access to give me a call, or he can give you all my contact information as well. But so forage growing conditions are the issue, not necessarily what forage it is or what soil it is, but the conditions at which that forage is growing and then being grazed. So water-saturated soil, which is implied in that, is low oxygen penetration in the soil. Temperate forages, primarily being tall fescue wheat, crested wheat, or fertilized brome grass. Whether cool temperatures during that growing time frame, with a sort of a reasonable threshold to think about is a 5-day average of a temperature less than 57 degrees Fahrenheit. And here in Iowa, that seems like a pretty warm temperature. So it is somewhat of a challenging issue to stay on top of. As environmental changes or environmental factors change, and certainly none of us can control those. And then ammonium fertilization of those forages or the ground that you're growing those forages on. And a lot of times we would fertilize with ammonium sulfate or ammonium nitrate and see a really nice production response out of those grasses. But one of the things to keep in mind is that is indeed true, but then the way that those forages are fermented when the animal consumes them is the issue that we're dealing with here today. And then another risk factor, something to keep in mind for sure, is there's a ranking in susceptibility to grass tetany. So dairy animals, and this are more susceptible than British breeds. British breeds are more susceptible to Brahman-influenced cattle, and that implied in that is capacity for milk production. Now that's not the whole story, but that is a very significant factor. So the more milk your cows produce, the more susceptible they are to grass tetany if the growing conditions indeed are right for tetany to develop. Okay, rumen fermentation. What happens in the rumen that will result in a tetany problem are this series of issues. Highly fermentable carbohydrates from the forage, elevated levels of ruminal ammonia, and that's coming from the forage, but that's because the protein in those forages is so highly fermentable and ferments so rapidly. In addition, there's an increased forage level of potassium. Here's that protein digestibility piece I mentioned. And then total fat or lipids in those forages also increases associated with the development of tetany. And we think that's due to an increased flow rate of rumen contents, such that the contents that those animals have consumed doesn't stay in the rumen as long. And then giving that animal less opportunity to absorb the magnesium that indeed they may have eaten. The results of forage fermentation due to growing conditions is the issue. And so that's one of the things that I want to keep coming back to is it's the growing conditions that are several different factors come together to create or generate aspects and characteristics within forage that when that forage is consumed, tetany develops. Here we'll be looking at a series of papers or articles that were primarily done in Oklahoma on wheat pastures and other forage sources. But one of the things to understand is sometimes in the forage you may not see a different level of calcium or magnesium, but then it's dependent on the potassium level as well as the fermentability of the protein there, how much ammonia is generated. So one of the things that I hope we come out of this session with is understanding how complex this issue really is and how many different factors are involved. Okay, here's a slide that's a data slide, a table that sets up sort of what our magnesium requirements are for cows, and recognizing that up in the orange I have highlighted the varying requirements throughout even associated with the stage of production. Growing finishing cattle are at 0.1% of the diet. Early lactations at 0.2 or double that amount. So really, here's where lactation really is one of the driving requirements for magnesium, and a couple of things that we'll look at here throughout this table. So sort of a calculation of what magnesium requirements would be. Below here we've got a 600 kilogram cow, or 1,350 pounds, milking, calculated to milk over this range of 10 to 30 kilograms. And notice here at a high potassium intake what the magnesium requirements would be at 22.5 grams per day for that low milking animal. But at a lower potassium intake, that requirement goes down to 17 grams per day. So here's a good illustration of how the potassium level affects the magnesium requirement. And so you might look at your forage and say, well, my magnesium requirement is adequate at 0.2%, but that will be impacted by what the potassium levels in that forage are. And then here's what the predicted intake of those animals might be based on, really that's driven by their level of milk production. Okay, so here I want to introduce a series of the series of events that results in tetany. All right, so here's a table, or a graph, excuse me, that is compiled by some researchers that did this work in Oklahoma. And here they had seeded rye that was seeded in September. This graph ranges in time from the 6th of December to the I think the 23rd of April, and so it's that winter grazing time frame. In the cows that were 16 cows in this trial, 5 of these cows developed a staggering tetany on March 19th, excuse me, as I have labeled down there in the bottom. So one of the things I want us just to kind of get a picture of is what are the issues that are happening that would result in the development of a tetany problem. And so here 5 out of 16 cows are down or staggering. So, you know, that's a reasonable, certainly a time for, or a proportion of total animals that's significant enough that we all need to pay attention. All right, so notice what temperature I have in the orange arrow, sort of an indication of what the trend line would be for average temperature, a high and a low. Notice how as that tetany date approaches, temperature's getting better, but notice what's happening to plant growth. In the yellow, a bit of an estimate there, but the amount of forage production is dramatically increasing. And so we all like to see that when we're grazing animals, but one of the warning signs when you know that you're in a tetany-prone area. Okay, moving on. Here we have this kind of what are some of the parameters of those forages. So on the top lines in this graph, same study. So again, we're looking at cows that are grazing wheat pasture or a wheat rye blend in Oklahoma. And notice what happens to organic matter and forage digestibility, or IVDMD. Both increase dramatically, and that's good. That means forage quality is going up or increasing. However, look at what's happening to the dry matter on the bottom blue arrow. It's decreasing in a very rapid rate. So that implies that the fermentability of what is growing there is increasing. So the rate of fermentation is what we're concerned about. Okay. So here's there's the picture of rate of fermentation. Now here's the calcium magnesium numbers in those same forages. there's the kind of the requirement in the green line of what forages should be. Notice in this forage, in these forages, those yeah, okay. In these forages, calcium is at should 0.3. It ranges 0.16 to 0.25, and magnesium should be 0.2, and it's below requirement throughout the time frame. In addition, then look what happens to forage crude protein. Well, excuse me, there's the sort of trend lines for calcium and magnesium over that time frame. But then look what happens to crude protein. It increases pretty significantly as well, which again, that means it's better forage, right? Well, one of the things to keep in mind as a manager is, okay, I've got this risk factor for tetany, and is my forage in the conditions that would cause a tetany problem? And again, we're going back to what happens in the rumen and the fermentation of that forage. All right, the next slides is out of the second study from that work in Oklahoma. And here are those 5 cows that that had a clinical tetany event. And one of the things I want to bring out as the part of the complicating factor here is the hormones that respond to that are responding during a tetany event are the hormones that regulate calcium concentration or serum calcium concentration. So we have here the trends. So the orange arrow is the tetany event, and then you have the trends of parathyroid hormone for the trends approaching that tetany day for serum levels of magnesium and serum levels of calcium. And notice that as the tetany event approaches, calcium levels go down, which means that parathyroid hormone is going to be increasing because that's the relationship there. But interestingly, as parathyroid hormone is going down, magnesium is increasing. And so this is very much a relationship between calcium, magnesium, and how calcium is controlled, or how we understand calcium to be controlled, and the hormones that signal what that blood level should be. So here again, this is the complicating factor. It's not just managing magnesium concentration or magnesium in forage. It's the overall situation about minerals in forage, and primarily the relationship between the balance, I should say, balance between calcium, magnesium, and their relationship together with potassium. Excuse me. So I just wanted to put this in here to show you or illustrate just how critical lactation is to magnesium requirements. Here we have a data slide of another project. This was done in Oklahoma, I think. I could look that up, but you have the reference there. But you just see how magnesium requirement changes dramatically. And there's really a break point in the line of what serum magnesium and calcium concentrations are pre-calving and post-calving. All right, so here we've got some the results of a study where we're looking at cows that indeed, here are 5 different cows that indeed showed a tetany event, clinical signs of grass tetany, the date at which those signs were displayed, and here I have highlighted what are serum level concentrations, the threshold that's required for an animal to, when they're below 1 to 1.5 milligrams per deciliter of magnesium, that animal will be showing tetany signs in combination with a calcium level less than 9 milligrams per deciliter. And you'll notice here that not all the animals were below the clinical tetany threshold. Neither were they, that same animal, 277 there on the top, was not hypocalcemic. Yet she showed signs of being hypocalcemic, and in the paper, there's the implication that it's the high potassium level that's driving that overall clinical observation in that animal. So again, this illustrates the balance between, like I mentioned before, the balance between calcium, magnesium, and their relationship with potassium. Okay, in forages, here's the analysis of mineral content of forages in fields that had historically been known to generate tetany issues in cattle when those cattle had been grazing forages in those areas. So this is very much based on the soils in those areas, and we have various regions in the state of Kansas, numbers of sites that were analyzed, wheat, brome, fescue, forages, so a range of different forages, and then what their calcium levels were. Note that the calcium level isn't necessarily below requirement. However, in this study, in these forages, the magnesium requirement certainly is below requirement. I have the average in the study there on the second line from the bottom, and then what requirement would be on the bottom. And you see that in this situation, the magnesium level certainly would be driving any tetany responses that might be observed. So how to manage this issue? Okay, so one thing is it's the growing conditions. So being aware of what those conditions were, if you're renting ground or if you're managing that ground yourself, do you know what the risk factor? Are you aware of the risk factors at the time and how that will impact your animals? A couple of things in addition to that: older cows are at greater risk. They just have less ability to mobilize magnesium out of their skeleton. Next would be the use of some interseeded legumes or legume hay, alfalfa hay, clover hay. There have more calcium in those forages, and that's one way to manage the risk for tetany. The use of supplements, of course, is another way, and we're here today to consider the value and what SweetPro supplements have to offer. So the lick tubs from SweetPro, let's think about the SweetPro 16, which is sort of the base product, and then the other products are in many ways developed off of what the SweetPro 16 is. That is a 1.5% calcium, which you can see in the feed tag, 2.5% magnesium, and in the study that in the slide that we just looked at previously, remember those forages were 0.3% calcium and 0.11 or 0.12% magnesium. So I just took that forage number and put it in the estimated magnesium requirement we thought about previously in the presentation. So these diets are going to be tetanogenic. In that first diet's only going to provide at that level of intake 11 grams of magnesium. 20 is the threshold, and you can see how that difference in intake drive the magnesium levels in those animals. And then at the recommended daily consumption of SweetPro at a pound a day, here's where SweetPro is going to be just for magnesium. It's going to bring in 11 grams, and here's where those cattle are going to be as far as with respect to their requirement. And notice how on a comparatively lower potassium level, you certainly have less magnesium requirements. So, and this is just at a pound a day. If you let that intake on the SweetPro float a little bit or increase a bit, you certainly bring in more magnesium to those animals. So how do we manage this issue? We have what those growing conditions are. Just understanding that and the risk factors that are building over time, type of forage, etc. Coordination of calving with the estimated tetany date within a given area, and that is somewhat well known, what the tetany date in a given region might be. If that's not well characterized, I'm sure there's folks that can excuse me, kind of build that information. Adequate supplementation prior to parturition to build adequate body reserves is certainly a good approach, and you build in some protection in that way. Coordinating the age of cows, whether they're on fescue, wheat, or brome in the spring. Just knowing the age of your cow and what forage they're on at the time of calving is going to be very significant. Then using supplements that do not contribute to the cohort of rumen fermentation challenges. This is where I think SweetPro really has a lot to offer, because the protein in SweetPro is primarily from distiller's greens, which has a significant bypass component. And so that's not going to contribute to the ammonia issue that exacerbates the tetany problems. And the energy source in SweetPro is not soluble sugars, whatever source that might be. Just think about it as soluble sugars, which the rate of fermentation of those sugars contributes to the development of tetany. So that's why I like the use of SweetPro for this application. Yes, it delivers enough magnesium, but it also is in the form that then doesn't contribute more to the problem, which, depending on the formulation that you're considering, or other supplements that are out there, lick tub or otherwise, that's an interesting and valuable quality. Then just some comments on SweetPro. I've mentioned a few things, but excuse me, SweetPro is built on corn distiller's grains. As I mentioned, does not generate excessive ruminal ammonia, and because it's primarily bypass protein. It's a soluble fiber and not sugars, and which then balances the non-structural carbohydrate fermentation that are in the forages that contribute to the tetany issue. When cattle have been accustomed to SweetPro, their dietary intake of that product is very consistent, and that's another thing comparatively to other supplements out there that's important to consider, is how do you know how much any given animal is getting, and what can you do as a manager to optimize that most of the animals get the appropriate amount of intake. And then there's a very adequate vitamin mineral package for SweetPro that does deliver adequate magnesium and calcium levels in a tetany-prone region, or in tetany-prone forages. And then, of course, the yeast culture, which we can get into at another time, but does bring some significant value to what nutritional value to a ruminant animal. And here's the list of resources that this information comes from. Glad to help Tim out or contribute to you're all gathering together and thinking over what SweetPro is, and look forward to hearing from any of you or Tim, and if any questions come up, here's my contact information. It was at the beginning of the talk as well, and look forward to how things go for you. Have a good evening, and that's all from me.